The only person, and I truly believe this, certainly with a big film, who has the whole film or some version of the whole film in his head is the director. And everyone is looking to you for that level of leadership, and you have to describe what it is that they need to do.
This event is, as you know, entitled Your Life in Pictures. But of course, you had another life, a hugely successful career before you got to the pictures, which was in theatre. How actively did you pursue a career in pictures, or was it an accidental sidestep?
Well, I went to Cambridge not knowing what I wanted to do at all. Theatre then presented itself to me, and I tried it and discovered that I loved to do it and that I felt that I had something to say eventually. That was the course I took. Film, I think if you're in any way interested in doing film in this country, certainly 30 years ago, it seemed an impossible path to take. And then, of course, theatre became my home, and for 15 years that's what I did. And then gradually I came back to the possibility of doing movies, mainly because at that time there were fellow theatre directors who had made that step. The Ken Branaghs and the Nick Heitners and the Roger Michels and the Danny Boyles were all directing theatre in the early 90s, and they showed that it was possible to do that.
How much was transferable from your background in theatre?
Well, I've always said I think that theatre directing and film directing are completely and utterly different in almost every respect. And I think if you're working with an actor, for example, what you're seeking to do on stage is to find a way to engage their outside eye so that what they're doing in rehearsal they can repeat. In film, what you're trying to do is the opposite. You're trying to disconnect the outside eye. You're trying to encourage spontaneity and freedom and no self-editing at all. In theatre, it's about repetition. The French call rehearsals répétition, and that is what it is. For me, coming from the theatre, unless it goes in front of an audience, it doesn't feel like it exists. I remember when I first made American Beauty, them saying, look, this is such an unusual film, you don't have to preview it because an audience might not know what it is, which I thought was a very dismissive way of talking to an audience. But nevertheless, they were worried that it was going to score badly in a preview and it would knock me. And I said, actually, I want to go out there and do it because for me, I need to hear whether they laugh, I need to know whether there are boring bits.
Kevin Spacey tells a great story about the very first day's shoot on this film and how you got to the end of it and decided it was all rubbish and everything except the script did not work, so you made them do it all over again.
I was very fortunate in a way because everything about it was crap. So it was very clear to me, not on the day, I hasten to add, on the day I was very proud of it. I thought, my God, I've done my first day. Isn't it great? I said action and cut and people turned up and, we finished the scene. I mean, the things that you think about when you haven't really done that before. And I went to the screening room at DreamWorks to watch it, and it was very clear to me that I'd actually been lucky in a way because everything about it was wrong. The costumes were a little broad, performances were over the top, the framing was very stiff. I hadn't directed the background properly. In fact, they said, how do you think it's going? And I said, I've got to be honest, I really don't think it's right. Both days, it was the first 2 days, and can you let me do it again, please? They were slightly taken aback, but I think that after that, they knew I was so adamant about what it was, it clarified what I was trying to do. And from then on, it got increasingly better, I think. After a couple of weeks, I hit my stride. The thing about American Beauty, it was a brilliant script. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the script found its way to me was one of the luckiest things that's ever happened to me. And Alan, he was a first-time screenwriter. Producers Dan and Bruce were first-time film producers, and I was a first-time director. So actually, it was a gang of people finding out how it worked all at the same time. And that was also helpful because I never felt patronized or guided by another person. I felt like I was able to discover the movie I wanted to make for myself.
And what kind of a director of actors did you turn out to be, a film director of actors?
For me, directing actors on screen is different because you're trying to encourage a kind of lack of self-awareness. And for example, I found myself directing Kevin very hard on film. We were often do 12, 13, 14 takes, which for me is quite a lot, because he's all about being the smartest guy in the room. It's very crisp what he does. It's very deliberate. There's a great attack, but sometimes it's just too fully formed. I needed to feel like he was just in the moment, always in the moment, working out what to do next. Again, that sort of freedom to just kick things around.
Did you ever feel that you needed to kind of tone it down, or did anybody try and sort of rein you in?
No, nobody ever tried. I mean, and you know, it is challenging. It's a very, very bold orchestration of dissonant tones, the film. It's very unusual in that regard, that you shift from something that has that kind of level of poetry, both visual and spoken, and shift into something openly theatrical in a way. But I always felt attached to the screenplay. From the moment I read it, I had a way of doing it. And from what was in my head to the end result is almost the closest with my first movie than with any other.
How much did you get a sense that you were getting a second shot at telling the story when you got to the edit process?
Oh, editing was I couldn't believe how much fun it was. When I first got in there, I couldn't believe how free you feel and how creative it is. It's the closest you ever get to writing as a director, if you haven't written the script. But for me, a lot of directing is rhythm. And that's something that I was able to manipulate in the editing room.
And so you got to the end of this one, and then sort of thought you'd do it all over again. But was there ever a point when you just thought, oh God, this is just so hard, I'm going back to, you know, the kind of smaller world of theatre that you...
Oh, I think that every time I make a film, yeah. I've had enough of this, I'm going back and doing a play, and that's how I get my feet back on the ground. You know, for me, it's odd, the very fact that we're here talking about my life in pictures, because I don't equate it as a consistent line of movies, because that's not how I worked. To me, American Beauty is part of a group of work that include The Blue Room and Cabaret on Broadway, which were the two things that I did immediately before American Beauty. For me, I can see the influence of those productions in the film. Road to Perdition was the time that I was doing Uncle Vanya and Twelfth Night at the Donmar. So I see it as a sort of organic body of work. Sounds very pretentious, but it's true.
And so how did you get Road to Perdition?
I was sent it by DreamWorks, who had produced American Beauty. It was a lumpy script, but I loved the central idea, which was this father and son who were cut adrift in a sort of mid-America in the 30s. And it seemed to me to have a kind of grandeur of almost a Greek tragedy. And we shot it in Chicago in the dead of winter, and it was a very solitary, lonely time, coming back from making American Beauty and all the acclaim and feeling myself very sort of isolated. And a lot of that went into the film. And by the way, I should say, one of the 2 or 3 happiest collaborations of my artistic life, theatre and film, was with Conrad Hall, who was the cinematographer of both American Beauty and Road to Perdition. True lighting cameramen are very, very thin on the ground. And I think when you find 1 or 2, and I've had lucky enough to have 3 of them, you have to hold on to them because it's a real art.
What kind of discussions did you have around the look and flavour?
I felt I wanted to not fetishize the period. I wanted to feel like we were looking through a window into another time, and for it not to be writ large, the style. But Hopper was obviously a huge influence in the way that he isolates people in interiors. But Hopper had also been an influence for American Beauty because he paints people locked behind glass in kind of cages, frames, always trapped within frames. And that's something that has been a continuous visual theme in other movies I've made as well. Just something that interests me.
I just wanted to touch on the fact that this was Paul Newman's final live action role.
Yes, it's very rare that one gets to work with one's heroes. And it's even rarer to find that they're still heroes when you finish working with them. And Paul was one of those people. Judi Dench is a similar person who makes everyone around them better. They are the least grand people. They want to work. They don't take themselves very seriously, but they take the work seriously. And, you know, somebody like that, you might be nervous about for half an hour, but the moment you meet him, he's just an actor who wants to do a good performance. All he was interested in, frankly, was bringing beef sandwiches to the set from a local Chicago cafe that he'd found, and you know, cooking people chicken on a Sunday. He was a great man, really. Amazing guy.
There's one very constant through line, which is your collaboration with Thomas Newman.
I remember hearing the score for Shawshank Redemption, which I think is one of the great, it's a great movie and it's a great score. I was trying desperately to persuade him to do this little movie for nothing. And he wrote an unbelievable score for American Beauty, so varied and so nuanced and so witty and with so much fun and zest in it. It was very interesting coming onto the Bond movies with Skyfall, for example, that there was a great trepidation, shall we say, from the producers and from the studio about using Tom Newman to write an action score. Tom proved that he could do it. In fact, he won the BAFTA and was nominated for an Oscar for the Skyfall score, which was a brilliant score. But, you know, I think that he's incredibly gifted and somebody that you just have a shared language with.
Let's sidestep to the Gulf War.
Yes.
Tell us about Jarhead.
I've always challenged myself to do each movie different from the last. And the only time I've not adhered to that rule is doing 2 Bond movies back to back. I'd often thought, what would have happened if I had been conscripted, if I had been born in the Second World War, if I'd had to fight? And there was this book written by a literate person who was, in a sense, sent to war. So it felt to me like the sort of thing that might happen if I had been in those circumstances. But it was a very trickily timed film. But it was also, for me, an opportunity to throw out everything I'd done in the first 2 movies. I didn't want a storyboard. I didn't want the camera to stand still. I wanted to shoot it handheld. I had a new cinematographer, Roger Deakins. We were often shooting on 2 cameras. And I wanted a freedom in front of camera to take away some of the stiffness and some of the formality that I felt making the previous 2 films. So I threw out the rule book, if you like, and started again.
Where does Revolutionary Road sit in your family of errant children?
Oh, gosh. Well, it was a movie it was a really unusual film to make because I was directing my then wife in a movie about an unhappy marriage. So join the dots. Although at the time I would have said absolutely not autobiographical in any way. And a movie in which I happen to think she's completely brilliant as well, by the way, and as is Leo. I found it very frustrating because it's based on a great novel, and novels are not shaped like movies. Movies tend to be linear on the whole, the best of them, I think. One of the things I struggled with between Skyfall and Spectre, for example, was that Skyfall for me was a linear movie and Spectre was web-shaped. And that's web-shaped is a great shape for an episodic television show, for example. You explore each strand of the web and then you discover who's sitting in the middle of the web, perhaps in episode 8, right? But as a movie, not quite so easy to try and manipulate that shape into a clear narrative over 2.5 hours. And Revolutionary Road has a problem, which is that it starts with them, a couple very, very unhappy. It takes them to happiness briefly, and then it takes them back down to where they started. Well, that fundamentally, I always struggled with as a shape, a narrative shape, is that they start. So what I did was to try to put at the front of the movie the day that they meet, which is the moment when there is hope, and you do see their beauty and their love for each other. But it never quite felt organic. That was something I did in the cutting room. Timing is a lot with movies, right? I mean, American Beauty was perfectly timed for its place and time in the world. It was, you know, it was the end of the millennium. It was post-Columbine. Everyone was obsessed with what weapons were being made next door. But it was pre-9/11. I fear that had it been post-9/11, it would have been seen as a very navel-gazing movie, a very self-obsessed movie. But at the time, it was perfect. I felt the same a little bit about Skyfall, which was that it came at absolutely the right time. You know, Bond had parachuted into the Olympic Stadium with the Queen, and the whole thing was, there was a sort of fever of, you know, of nationalism and feeling good about the country. And it was just well timed. Revolutionary Road was absolutely the worst possible time. It was the middle of an economic crunch. You know, people were really worried about where the next dollar was coming from in America. And there was a story about 2 very good-looking people living in a nice house, you know, obsessing about whether they're going to move to Paris or not. And on top of that, it was freighted with these sort of, you know, award expectations because of who was in it and who had made it and all of those things. But I think if you get past all that, and one of the nice things about movies is that you can and you do look back with some sort of greater knowledge, you know, several years later. I think what you see is actually a really well-made film, which with very, very truthful performances in it.
Tell us about the process of you getting involved with Bond, because it just seems so unlikely.
My way in was Daniel. I mean, I've never made any secret of that. Daniel I cast in Road to Perdition. I'd known him for 10, 15 years. You know, they called me to say, we hear this rumour that Daniel Craig is going to be cast as Bond just before Casino Royale. What do you think? And I said, and I'm on record as saying, I think it's a terrible idea. Because at that point, you know, Bond for me was Pierce Brosnan, and Roger Moore was a kind of urbane, you know, slightly kind of eyebrow-raising, cool, but slightly detached figure, who dealt mostly in irony. And you know, Daniel was all truth and reality and intensity and toughness, and I felt I didn't see how the two could go together. But of course, as soon as they did cast him, and I saw the movie, I thought it was thrilling, and it reminded me of what it felt like to see the early Bond movies with Sean. So for me, my way in was Daniel, and I was trying to find a way to come back to England. I felt I wanted to make an English film, and I also wanted to make a film on a large scale again, because I hadn't for a while. He just made Quantum of Solace, and I said, so who's going to do the next one? And he said, I don't know, why don't you do it? And I honestly had not thought about it until that moment. The moment he said it, I thought, yeah, why not? And hearing him talk about it really got me engaged. And then it grew from there. Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson found me in New York, took me out to lunch, and asked me why I wanted to do it. And I think I said something like, I want to be the coolest dad in the school, or something like that, which was partly true as well. That was the other thing. I wanted to do a movie that my kids could see, because I'd made all these R-rated movies with scenes like, featuring their mother killing herself. So there's a bunch of stuff that they couldn't really witness, and in fact they still haven't. So but I thought, it's time to do something that's just completely and utterly different and challenge myself in a different way. And so, crafting the screenplay of Skyfall, I found myself steering the writers, who were all brilliant, into writing a movie about someone who goes away from England and comes back to find that everything is changed, which really is, in a sense, what I'd gone through, and forces them to explain and define why they are who they are and why they do their job and what the point of Bond is, and by inference, what the point of MI6 and the whole Secret Service is. And beyond that, what's the point of Bond movies? And we had a very, very wonderful stroke of luck, which is that, well, in retrospect, it was a wonderful stroke of luck at the time. It was a pain in the neck, which is that MGM went bankrupt, and we had 9 months downtime when we weren't officially allowed to work on the film. So everything stopped, except the work with the writers. And we spent 9 months going down various blind alleys with the script and with the story, and gradually this story emerged. And it takes that long. And one of the things I found frustrating about Spectre was I didn't quite have the amount of time I wanted.
I wonder whether there's ever a point with a Bond film where you're literally just directing a film, as in getting the right performances out of actors, or whether there's always the kind of weight of, the stuff that goes around it.
What happens, I think, with larger movies now is that you're in a dialogue with the audience from a very early stage. Your audience is commenting on and reviewing the title, the press conference, the casting, the song, the trailer, the second trailer, the poster, and it's a constant dialogue that goes on for sort of 18 months. And so you have to just create a world around the camera which is absolutely private. And that doesn't matter whether it's the largest scene in the movie or the smallest. You can only shoot one thing at a time. And it's an act of will, and you have to be very, very strong, and you have to be very hard with your rules. I've only just started reading the papers again now after 18 months. Social media, just cut off, because otherwise it does genuinely affect what you're doing, because there's opinions out there all the time. And if people, for example, guess from a trailer, guess the plot, it's very, very difficult because you're still making the film. I mean, these trailers are being cut while you're still shooting. So you've got to try and find a way to isolate yourself and at the same time help the actors find the truth of what they're doing.
How do you navigate the kind of your own vision when you've got all those kind of potentially opposing views on the other side?
The only person, and I truly believe this, certainly with a big film, who has the whole film or some version of the whole film in his head is the director. And everyone is looking to you for that level of leadership. And you have to describe what it is that they need to do. And that goes for the producers as well. The producers are just below you in the sense that they can see what you're shooting. But Barbara and Michael, who by the way are brilliant hands-off producers, they know when to get involved, but most of the time they trust you and they leave you to your own devices. If they have a problem, they'll come and say it. At any one moment in Spectre, for example, I was in Mexico City shooting a sequence, and at the same time, second unit was in the Alps finishing off a road chase, and I was watching, on an iPad, shots that they were doing and trying to talk to Alex Witt, the second unit director, on the phone, while there were 2 helicopters in the air, and I was shouting over the noise of 2 helicopters, and at the same time, there are 3 sets being built back at Pinewood, and there's an aerial unit also shooting in a different part of Mexico, a different helicopter, because some of the stunts we were unable to do them in the high altitude of Mexico City. So you basically got 5 or 6 units all working flat out, all desperately needing answers from you. At the end of the day, you need to be very, very clear about what you want, and you have to keep going until you have it. It doesn't just depend on the coordination of 2,000 fully costumed extras and, you know, Daniel walking at exactly the right speed and the camera operator. When you walk into the lobby of the hotel, you're walking into a hotel that actually wasn't there. It was further down the street. When you come into the hotel room, you're going to Pinewood. When you come out of the hotel room, you're going onto a rooftop in Mexico. Not only a rooftop in Mexico, a rooftop with 350 feet of track and a techno crane, you know, and God knows how many crew manipulating that so that we see everything beyond, including the musicians and the maquettes and the giant puppets that were made by the good people of Mexico City. 2,500 people working in tandem at the same time is a really big high for a director. God. When everyone gets it right, it's very exhilarating. And it's not just for the director, for the crew as well. You have people who've been on crews for 40 years, who've made 14 Bond movies saying, I've never seen anything like this.
Did you have much conversation about the kind of, you know, the British identity that comes out of a Bond film, or the way that's palatable for an international audience?
You're not trying to package Englishness. Ultimately, these movies are mythology. You know, it is one of the great contemporary myths. It's lasted over half a century. There's a reason for that. There is a need for that degree of mythic storytelling. It's always had one foot in the real and one foot in the fantasy. It's about a tone. It's about walking that knife edge between the two, because one step too far to the right and you're in Marvel world now, and the other one step to the left and you're in Bourne world. Bourne can disappear in Waterloo Station, no problem. Bond can't do that. You know, he travels with a sort of force field around him. You can put him in the real world, but for a very brief time, because he loses his power. When I decided to do another Bond movie, I had to sort of look at the first film. I looked at Skyfall and thought, okay, well, what do I want to do differently, and how do I want to change things? And one of the things I felt with Skyfall was the first 10 minutes felt a little relentless. It felt through-scored. It felt lacking in rhythm. And I said earlier, one of the things that defines, I think, for me, one director from another is their sense of rhythm. But I feel like one of the things you get for free with a Bond movie is the first 10 minutes. You don't have to explain who your central character is. You don't really have to explain the tone. You have the ability, the chance to drop an audience right into the middle of something and tell them nothing about it, and there's 10 minutes free time. So not only do they know the actor, they know the character. There's a great Hitchcock line. They asked Hitchcock, you know, why do you always cast movie stars? Why do you cast Jimmy Stewart and Cary Grant? And he says, because it saves me 10 minutes of exposition. Because the audience know Cary Grant. I don't need to explain Cary Grant. He's just Cary Grant. And that's something you get with Bond, which you would never have with another movie, where you're not having to introduce the world. It's a pretty amazing job to have, and it's a very, very wonderful privilege to be able to do it, and to know that an audience will also come and see it too.
Thank you so much. Sam Mendes. Thank you.
But you know, what you learn from great comics is rhythm. You know, what I learned from watching Rossiter and Cleese and Barker and all those guys is rhythm and timing. And that is the same across all genres of movies, not just comedy, but everything.